Feminist Poetics by Elaine Showalter. And in yesterday's class, we mentioned we discussed the two varieties of feminist criticism that Showalter talks about. The first one is called the feminist critique, and that deals with women as readers of male-produced literature and of male-produced literary history and literary criticism, whereas the second variety, which she privileges over the first, is called gynocritics. And this deals with women as writers. So gynocritics is a form of feminist criticism. It is a variety of feminist criticism that looks at women as writers. It looks at the history of women's writing, the history of not just individual women writers, but also their affiliations and connections with other women writers. And if it has a theoretical framework, then it will not be borrowed from already existing male-produced theoretical frameworks, but rather it will be formed from women's experiences. And she began the essay actually by talking about, and that part is not there in your textbook, but she began the essay by talking about the very need to have a clear theory for feminist literary criticism. So that is the first important point she makes in the essay, and that is what we discussed yesterday. And now in today's class, we will look at a certain kind of feminist literary historiography that Showalter creates in her essay. So before we can even begin to ask how the literature of women would be different and special, we need to reconstruct its past, to rediscover the scores of women novelists, poets, and dramatists whose work has been obscured by time, and to establish the continuity of the female tradition. As we recreate the chain of writers in this tradition, the patterns of influence and response from one generation to the next, we can also begin to challenge the periodicity of orthodox literary history and its enshrined canons of achievement. It is because we have studied women writers in isolation that we have never grasped the connections between them. When we go beyond Austen, the Brontes, and Eliot, say, to look at 150 or more of their sister novelists, we can see patterns and phases in the evolution of a female tradition which correspond to the developmental phases of any subcultural art. In my book on English women writers titled A Literature of Their Own, I have called these the feminine, feminist, and female stages. So these are the three phases of a feminist tradition, or the three stages of a feminist literary tradition that Elaine Showalter proposes. So this is the second most important point in her essay. First one was the two varieties of feminist criticism, and the third point is the three phases or the three stages of feminist literary tradition. So what has she been saying so far? Phase but before that, what is she talking about? Gynocritics, we mentioned, looks at the literature of women, literature written by women, and what is different and special about it. But before we can begin to study that, before we can even begin to ask the question of what is so different and special about the literature written by women, we need to reconstruct its past. We need to rediscover the scores, the tens and 20s and hundreds of women writers, whether they are novelists, poets, and dramatists, whose work has been obscured by time. So there were so many women writers writing across the centuries, but many of them have been forgotten. Their work has been obscured by time, and we need to rediscover all of them and to re-establish or to establish the continuity of the female tradition. So we need to, just like canonical history, we need to create a history of the female tradition, of the female literary tradition as well, so that we do not think that women writers are just individuals writing in the middle of male-dominated literary history, but rather as we recreate the chain of writers in this tradition. This is why we are doing it. This is the reason why we are trying to recreate this chain of writers, the patterns of influence and response from one generation to the next. So we will see as we recreate, as we try to recreate this history of women's literary tradition, women's writing, we will be able to see the patterns of influence and response, how one generation of women writers influenced the next, and how the next generation of women writers responded to the previous generation. This kind of patterns of influence and response is something that we can see only if we look at the history of women's writing as a chain, as a long tradition. We can also, as we do this, we can also begin to challenge the periodicity of Orthodox literary history and its enshrined canons of achievement. So as I mentioned yesterday, the Orthodox literary history, canonical literary history, has a certain kind of periodization. We divide literary history into different periods of literature, which you are very familiar with. And the periods are usually this periodization, the process of classifying literary history into different periods, is usually around the figure of a great male writer or a group of male writers. So that kind of periodicity has to be challenged, and it's enshrined canons of achievement. So which great writers are considered to be canonical, or which writings are considered to be an achievement. These are things that have to be challenged by gynocritics and by anybody who wishes to unearth the chain of female writers. And she says it is because we have always studied women writers in isolation that we have never grasped the connections between them. Again, as we mentioned yesterday, when we look at canonical history, we have here and there a few token female names like Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot, etc. And we do not see much connection between these women writers. We just see them as some exceptions among all the other writers who are predominantly male writers. So it is because we have studied women writers only in isolation that we have never grasped the connections between them. When we go beyond Austen, the Brontes and Eliot, say, to look at 150 or more of their sister novelists, only then can we see patterns and phases in the evolution of a female tradition, which correspond to the developmental phases of any subcultural art. So, number just a few writers, Austen, Bronte sisters, Eliot, അങ്ങനെ കുറച്ച് ഫീമെയിൽ റൈറ്റേഴ്സിനെ മാത്രം നോക്കിയാൽ നമുക്ക് ഇവർ തമ്മിലുള്ള കണക്ഷൻ എന്താണെന്നോ ഇവരുടെ റൈറ്റിംഗ്സിലുള്ള പാറ്റേൺസും ഒന്നും നമുക്ക് മനസ്സിലാവില്ല. പക്ഷെ അതേ കാലഘട്ടത്തിൽ എഴുതിയിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു 100-150 വിമൻ റൈറ്റേഴ്സിനെ നമ്മൾ നോക്കിയാൽ മാത്രമാണ് ഇവരെല്ലാവരും തമ്മിൽ എന്തൊക്കെ കണക്ഷൻസ് ഉണ്ട്. പാറ്റേൺ, ബിക്കോസ് പാറ്റേൺ ഇസ് ഓൺലി സംതിങ് യു ക്യാൻ സീ ഇഫ് യു ലുക്ക് അറ്റ് എ ലാർജ് നമ്പർ ഓഫ് texts. So if you want to see patterns in text, you can't just take one text and another text and say there are patterns. That may not be actually very useful. That may not be actually very clear. But rather, if you look at 150 writers and then you say, okay, we can see certain patterns in terms of similar themes, or certain kind of characterization, or certain kind of locations, or certain kind of subjects that are being addressed, then we can say, okay, there is a pattern among the 100 women writers who write during this particular time. And based on such patterns, based on the connections between women writers, we can divide the feminist literary tradition or the women writers tradition into different phases. And she's saying in any subcultural art, there are certain developmental phases. Any subcultural art goes through certain phases of development. And similarly, we can see such phases in the case of the female literary tradition as well. What does subcultural art mean? subculture is something that is that stands separate from the main culture, something that is marginalized from the main culture, and which sometimes rebels against the dominant culture. So in the case of literature, if the canonical male-produced literary tradition is the main culture or the dominant culture, then the female-produced literary tradition is the subculture. So in the case of any subcultural art, it will have certain phases of development, and similar phases of development can be seen in the matter of women's literary tradition as well. And there is a book by Elaine Showalter called A Literature of Their Own. And you can, of course, see she has borrowed the phrase from Virginia Woolf, who wrote a very important essay called A Room of One's Own, where she says that, Virginia Woolf says that in order for a woman to actually creatively express herself in writing with all full freedom, she needs money of her own and a room of one's own. So Showalter has borrowed that idea of a room of one's own, and now she has a book called A Literature of Their Own, which is about the literature of women writers. In this book, she has classified the developmental phases of the feminist literary tradition into three, and she calls them the feminine, feminist, and female stages in this order. First, feminine phase; second, feminist phase; and third, female phase. So these are the three phases or the three stages of female literary tradition. Okay, now we will go through each of these phases and see what they mean. During the feminine phase, this is the first phase, during the feminine phase, dating from about 1840 to 1880, women wrote in an effort to equal the intellectual achievements of the male culture and internalized its assumptions about female nature. The distinguishing sign of this period is the male pseudonym, introduced in England in the 1840s, and a national characteristic of English women writers. The feminist content of feminine art is typically oblique, displaced, ironic, and subversive. One has to read it between the lines in the missed possibilities of the text. So the first phase is called feminine phase, and Showalter dates this from around 1840 to 1880. So mid to late 19th century is what she calls the feminine phase. And this is a time when women wrote literature, but women, they had to write in a condition where all the great writers were supposedly men. So generally, there was an idea that the dominant culture was a male-produced culture, and it had some great intellectual achievements, and women had to work really hard. They had to put a lot of effort in order to equal the intellectual achievements of the male culture. So women tried to write according to what male writers considered to be a good way of writing, a proper way of writing. So the very language that they used would be very similar to the language used by men. And this is also why, as she says, the distinguishing sign of this period is the male pseudonym. Pseudonym means a pen name or a fake name, which was used by many women writers. And mostly this could be seen in England. The case in America is slightly different. She mentions that in the longer essay. But in England, usually during the first phase or the feminist phase, the most important characteristic, the distinguishing sign of this period is the fact that women writers wrote under male pseudonyms. And of course, the best known example is George Eliot herself. So many people, and as we mentioned yesterday, the Bronte sisters also wrote under the Bell pseudonym. So many women writers writing during this time wrote under the male pseudonym because they were afraid that if people knew they were women, they would not be published. And even if they are published, nobody would want to buy and read their works. So The very fact that they were able to pass themselves off as male writers means that they wrote in exactly the same way as men did. So it was not very easy to just read them. അവരുടെ പേര് ആരാണ് എഴുതിയതെന്ന് അറിയാതെ അവരുടെ വർക്ക് മാത്രം വായിച്ചു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ അതൊരു സ്ത്രീയാണ് എഴുതിയെന്ന് കൃത്യമായിട്ട് മനസ്സിലാവാൻ പറ്റണമെന്നില്ല. കാരണം പുരുഷന്മാർ എഴുതുന്ന അതേ രീതിയിലാണ്, അതേ സ്റ്റൈൽ ഫോളോ ചെയ്തിട്ടാണ് അവർ എഴുതിയിരുന്നത്. സോ മെയിൽ pseudonym ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. They tried to equal the intellectual achievements of male culture, and because of all that, they internalized the male culture's assumptions about female nature. പുരുഷന്മാർ എഴുതുന്ന അതേപോലെ എഴുതുന്നു എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ ദാറ്റ് മീൻസ് സ്ത്രീകളെ പറ്റി പുരുഷന്മാർ മനസ്സിലാക്കി അതേ രീതിയിൽ തന്നെയാണ് ഇവരും പ്രസന്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. കാരണം അന്ന് അതായിരുന്നു ഡോമിനന്റ് കൾച്ചർ. അതിനെതിരെ അവർക്ക് റെബൽ ചെയ്യാനൊന്നുള്ള അവസരം ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നില്ല. അവർക്ക് എന്തെങ്കിലും അവരുടെ ഇന്റലക്ച്വൽ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അവരുടെ ക്രിയേറ്റീവ് ആയ എക്സ്പ്രഷൻസ് പുറം ലോകത്തെ അറിയിക്കണമെങ്കിൽ തന്നെ the only way they had to do it was to pretend to be men, use a male pseudonym, write in the style that men wrote at that time, and even internalize the assumptions about female nature that were common to male writers of that time. As I mentioned, she says that this was a national characteristic of English women writers. ഇംഗ്ലണ്ടിലെ വിമൻ റൈറ്റേഴ്സിന്റെ പ്രത്യേകതയായിരുന്നു ഈ മെയിൽ pseudonymഉം മെയിൽ എന്ന രീതിയിൽ എഴുതുന്നത്. In America, she says it was slightly different. That is not part of your textbook, but from the original essay, she says that in America, what women did was something very interesting. Instead of pretending to be men, they wrote using hyper feminine hyper feminine names, and they wrote in a very extremely feminine fashion, so that people who saw it, men who read their works, did not feel threatened. So they would use pseudonyms, but hyper feminine pseudonyms like Fanny, Fern, and such Grace, Fanny, those kind of names they would choose, and the names would sound so gentle and soothing, and the kind of writing they wrote was also, it also seemed as if there is nothing political about it, nothing subversive about it, and because of that they were allowed to write, but men just did not take them very seriously. So this is the case in America. Whereas in England, women wanted to write, they wanted to be taken seriously, and therefore they wrote using male pseudonyms. But in both these cases, women were actually disguising their true self. They could not express their true self. In one case, they had to pretend to be men. In the other case, in America, they had to pretend to be ultra feminine or hyper feminine, and only if there is any there was feminist content even in their work, even though it is not very openly feminist or openly rebellious, and the feminist content of their art is typically oblique. Oblique means not straight, not direct, but something that you have to basically read between the lines in order to understand. So it is typically oblique, that is not straight, not direct, displaced. So you will not find feminism in the place that you expect to find it, but rather you will find it in something else, in certain descriptions or other things like that. You will not find direct references to feminism. Ironic and subversive. So they were very not direct, they were oblique, they were ironic, they were subversive, and you have to read between the lines in the missed possibilities of the text. So it is not in what the text says, but in what the text could have said. What are the missed possibilities of the text? ആ ടെക്സ്റ്റ് എന്ത് പറയുന്നു എന്നുള്ളതിലല്ല അതിലെ ഫെമിനിസം നമ്മൾ കാണുന്നത്. പക്ഷെ ആ ടെക്സ്റ്റ് എന്ത് പറയുന്നില്ല, ആ ടെക്സ്റ്റിന് എന്തുകൂടി പറയാമായിരുന്നു. മിസ്ഡ് പോസിബിലിറ്റി, ഒരു പോസിബിലിറ്റി ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു, പക്ഷെ അത് മിസ്സായി പോയി എന്ന് നമുക്ക് വായിക്കുമ്പോൾ തന്നെ നമുക്ക് തോന്നുക. അവിടെയാണ് ആ ടെക്സ്റ്റിലെ ഫെമിനിസം നമുക്ക് കാണാൻ പറ്റുന്നത്. ആൻഡ് ദീസ് ആർ ദ characteristic features of the first phase of feminist literary tradition, which Showalter calls the feminine phase. It dates from around 1840 to 1880. It is slightly different in England and in America. I hope this is clear. Okay, Elaine?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. So now we move on to the second phase, in which in this text she doesn't mention too much about it. In the feminist phase, the second phase is called the feminist phase, which is from about 1880 to 1920, or the winning of the vote. women are historically enabled to reject the accommodating postures of femininity and to use literature to dramatize the ordeals of wronged womanhood. The second phase, feminist phase, is an openly rebellious phase. It is from when the first phase ends, which is around 1880, to around 1920, or the winning of the vote. So this was a time from 1880 to 1920. This is a time when there is a movement for women's suffrage, or the voting rights for women. So this is a time when women were extremely rebellious against patriarchy, and in patriarchy in all its forms, against the male dominant culture, and against male produced literature as well. So during this time, until around the winning of the voting right for women, women were historically enabled. So because of all the kinds of feminist movements that are happening, all the movements for women's rights that were going on, women felt very much enabled, they felt empowered, and they were able to reject the accommodating postures of femininity. So in the earlier stage, in the feminine stage, they had to be very accommodating to male culture. They had to accommodate male culture. They had to bow down to male culture and accept their style, accept their judgments on society and on women. Now, in the second stage, women could reject it completely, and they could rebel against the dominant culture, and they were able to use literature to dramatize the ordeals of wronged womanhood. There was generally an impression during this time that women were being wronged in so many different ways in society. They were being denied the right to vote, they were being denied the right to property, and so many other ways in which women and their creative expressions were completely wronged by society, by male-dominated society, by patriarchal society. And what are the ways in which women were wronged, and what are the ways in which we should protest against that or rebel against that? These were highlighted by the women writers of the feminist phase. So literature for them became a tool using which they could dramatize the wrongs that were performed by society against women. So this is more or less direct rebellion. Second phase, feminist phase, around 1880 to 1920. Now the third phase is called the female phase. In the female phase, ongoing since 1920, women reject both imitation and protest, two forms of dependency, and turn instead to female experience as the source of an autonomous art, extending the feminist analysis of culture to the forms and techniques of literature. Representatives of the formal female aesthetic, such as Dorothy Richardson and Virginia Woolf, begin to think in terms of male and female sentences and divide their work into masculine journalism and feminine fictions, redefining and sexualizing external and internal experience. So just as in the case of the feminist critique, we mentioned that even though it is a critique against male-produced literature and their representations of women, it is still a kind of dependency because you are completely fixated on what men have said about women. Similarly, in the different phases also, in both the feminine and the feminist phase, there was a kind of dependency. Even though there were two different forms of dependency, there was a dependency on male culture. In the feminine phase, it was a direct dependency because women borrowed the styles and the nature of writing and the themes that men used at that time. In the feminist phase, it was a slightly indirect form of dependency because it was a rebellion, it was a protest against the male culture. But according to Showalter, both imitation and protest are two different forms of dependency. നമ്മൾ പുരുഷന്മാർ എഴുതുന്ന അതേ സ്റ്റൈൽ എഴുതുക എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്, അവരെ ഇമിറ്റേറ്റ് ചെയ്യുക എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് അത് ഒരു തരം ഡിപ്പെൻഡൻസി. വി ആർ ഡിപ്പെൻഡന്റ് ഓൺ ദെയർ ഫോം ഓഫ് റൈറ്റിംഗ്. അതുപോലെ തന്നെ പുരുഷന്മാർ എഴുതുന്നതിനെ എതിർക്കുക, എല്ലാം ആ ഒരു പ്രൊട്ടസ്റ്റ് മോഡിൽ, റെബല്യൻ മോഡിൽ പറയുമ്പോൾ എഗെയിൻ അത് മറ്റൊരു തരം ഡിപ്പെൻഡൻസി ആയി മാറുകയാണ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. ആ രണ്ട് തരം ഡിപ്പെൻഡൻസീസും റിജക്ട് ചെയ്യുന്നത് മൂന്നാമത്തെ ഫേസിലാണ്, വിച്ച് ഇസ് കോൾഡ് ദ ഫീമെയിൽ ഫേസ്. ആൻഡ് അക്കോർഡിംഗ് ടു ഷോവാൾട്ടർ, ദിസ് ഫീമെയിൽ ഫേസ് ഹാസ് ബീൻ ഓൺ ഗോയിങ് സിൻസ് 1920. സോ വോട്ടവകാശം കിട്ടിയതിന് ശേഷമുള്ള കാലഘട്ടത്തിലുള്ള ആ ഒരു ഫേസിനെയാണ് ഇന്ന് മുതൽ, ഇന്നെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ വെൻ ഷോൾട്ടർ ഇസ് റൈറ്റിംഗ് ദിസ് ഇൻ ദ ലേറ്റ് 1970s, അതുവരെ ഉള്ള ആ ഒരു ഫേസിനെയാണ് ഫീമെയിൽ ഫേസ് എന്ന് ഷോൾട്ടർ പറയുന്നത്. ആൻഡ് സോ ഇഫ് യു റിജക്ട് ബോത്ത് ഇമിറ്റേഷൻ ആൻഡ് പ്രൊട്ടസ്റ്റ്, then what do you have left? Instead, you turn to female experience as the source of an autonomous art. So you want your art to be autonomous, independent ആയിട്ട് ഫ്രീ ആയ, ഇൻഡിപെൻഡന്റ് ആയ, മറ്റാരെയും ഡിപ്പെൻഡ് ചെയ്യാത്ത ഒരു തരം ആർട്ട് ഉണ്ടാക്കണം. അതിന്റെ സോഴ്സ് എന്താണ്? ഫീമെയിൽ എക്സ്പീരിയൻസ്. ഓൺലി ഇഫ് വിമൻ depend on their own experiences, only if they draw upon their own experiences for their creative expression, can their art become truly autonomous. That was the belief behind the female face. And there they extended the feminist analysis of culture to the forms and techniques of literature. So it is not just about the different kind of ways of analyzing culture which feminists had already made popular, were extended to analyzing literature as well. And certain writers of this female face that she mentions are Dorothy Richardson and Virginia Woolf. And some of the interesting ways in which they work is to think in terms of male and female sentences and masculine journalism versus feminine fiction, etc. So what these writers are trying to say is that there is no point in saying that men all write in a particular way and women all write in a particular way, and that women should either write like men or write against that. Nothing like that. So they started thinking more from the perspective of their own experiences, and they started coming up with very experimental ways of writing and also experimental ways of understanding literature, experimental ways of criticism as well. അപ്പോൾ ഞാൻ ഇന്നലത്തെ ക്ലാസ്സിൽ പറഞ്ഞിരുന്നു, വെർജീനിയ വുൾഫ് പറഞ്ഞതായിട്ട്, that you can actually look at the writings of different writers, whether the actual writers are male or female. The style of writing can be divided into masculine, feminine, neutral, or androgynous. So like that, Virginia Woolf said that certain sentences can be considered male sentences and some other sentences can be considered female sentences. So that doesn't mean that men always write in male sentences and women always write in female sentences. Anganeyalla. Rather, whether you are a man or a woman, you can write, if you write in a particular style, then that is an example of male style. If you write in another style, then that is an example of a female style. So that is a way of writing. So even linguistics, even sentences can have gender, according to Woolf. She doesn't go very deeply. Woolf also doesn't go very deeply into what structural elements actually make a sentence male and another sentence female. She doesn't go very deeply into that. But these were some ideas that women writers and critics of that time were thinking about. Similarly, if you look at the genres of writing, journalism and fiction. So some women writers started saying that, okay, I will write one genre. I think that when I write journalistic writings, then I'm writing in a masculine fashion. And when I write fiction, when I write my creative fiction, then I am writing in a feminine fashion. So saying such things like that, whether those are correct ways of looking at them or not, the point is that women writers and critics of this period were trying to redefine and sexualize external and internal experience. So they would say that when I'm writing about my internal experience, my inner experiences, my thoughts, my emotions, etc., then I'm writing in a feminine fashion. When I'm writing about external factors, my relation to society, to politics, etc., to power structures, and to other categories like class, nation, religion, etc., then such external kind of writing about external themes is masculine. So these were different ways in which they try to redefine their own writing, so that they did not feel trapped either as imitators of male forms of writing or as women who were writing in a very specific way and rebelling against the male writers. Okay, so these are the three different phases that Showalter mentions: the feminine phase, the feminist phase, and the female phase. You should not forget the order. You should not mix up the order. This is very important. The feminine phase 1840 to around 1880. The feminist phase is 1880 to around 1920, or the winning of the vote. And the female phase is from 1920 to the present. It is ongoing since 1920. So I hope these three phases are now clear to you. Should we continue or pause? The next section is kind of, it's slightly long, but here she is talking about the need for feminism to have its own theory, and the need not to depend too much on male-produced literary theory. Shall we continue a little bit more, or are you guys tired? Any doubts so far?
No, ma'am.
Okay, now we continue cheyam, and then we will maybe pause for today. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, ma'am.
Okay. Okay. Now she says, in trying to account for these complex permutations of the female tradition, feminist criticism has tried a variety of theoretical approaches. The most natural direction for feminist criticism to take has been the revision and even the subversion of related ideologies, especially Marxist aesthetics and structuralism, altering their vocabularies and methods to include the variable of gender. I believe, however, that this thrifty feminine make-do is ultimately unsatisfactory. Feminist criticism cannot go around forever in men's ill-fitting hand-me-downs, the Annie Hall of English studies, but must, as John Stuart Mill wrote about women's literature in 1869, quote, emancipate itself from the influences of accepted models and guide itself by its own impulses, unquote, as I think gynocritics is beginning to do. This is not to deny the necessity of using the terminology and techniques of our profession. But when we consider the historical conditions in which critical ideologies are produced, we see why feminist adaptations seem to have reached an impasse. So she's saying, this is something that we have already discussed very briefly yesterday, about why it is a problem for feminist criticism to borrow their frameworks wholesale from male-produced models like Marxism, psychoanalysis, etc. So she's saying that now, if you are studying this female tradition through the different phases that she has already mentioned, you can see that there are many complex permutations of the female tradition. There are many manifestations of this female tradition. And in trying to understand these, feminist criticism has tried a variety of theoretical approaches. So the most natural way, the most easily available and adaptable theory was Marxist theory. So it was able to, so because feminism was also about subverting certain dominant ideologies, and Marxism was about subverting the dominant ideology of capitalism using the concept of class. Feminists thought, okay, this is very useful to us, we will use Marxist theory, just that instead of class or along with class, we will use the variable of gender. So just like Marxists talk about how we should invert the binaries that capitalism imposes on us, the binaries which are built on class, and we should look at everything from the point of view of class, including literature and culture. Similarly, feminists use the same methods, and then they just included the variable of gender. It was a very easy thing for them to do, or it is a very natural thing for them to do. But however, Showalter says that this is a kind of thrifty feminine make do, which is ultimately unsatisfactory, in the sense that she is again drawing on a certain stereotype of how women, housewives, are known to, make do. They are very thrifty. They don't want to spend extra money. So when, for example, one child grows out of their clothes, then the other child, then that clothes will be remodeled for the second child. Guys, just give me one moment. I will be back. Okay, sorry about that. So this idea that there is a kind of thrifty feminine make do happening here, that let us not spend too much effort in trying to create our own, let us not expend, or let's not spend too much effort in trying to create our own methodology, our own theoretical framework, if an available framework can be remodeled for our uses. That, she says, that is very similar to how housewives will remodel the clothes of older children for the other children, or so those kind of things. And she says feminist criticism cannot go around forever in men's ill-fitting hand-me-downs, like the Annie Hall of English studies. So she's saying that just like you will not sometimes, if you want to be very thrifty, you will wear your father's or your elder brother's clothes, shirts and all, and you will walk around. And Annie Hall is a character in a Woody Allen film. So that's she probably walks around like that. But the point is that she's saying borrowing male produced theories is just like borrowing the clothes of men to wear, because they don't anyway fit you. You should have clothes that are fitted for you. If you want a shirt, you should get a shirt that is in your size rather than wearing somebody else's shirt. Similarly, if you want a theory, you should actually create your own theory, model your own theory, rather than just borrowing some theory produced for some other purpose. Instead of that, she says, as John Stuart Mill wrote about women's literature in 1869, what women writers should do and what women critics should do is to emancipate themselves from the influence of accepted models. Already accepted models ഉണ്ട്, അതിനെ നമുക്ക് ഫോളോ ചെയ്യാന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ അതൊരു ഭയങ്കര ടെംപ്റ്റേഷൻ ആണ്. കാരണം ഞാനൊരു പുതിയ മോഡൽ ഉണ്ടാക്കിയാൽ അത് ലോകം ആക്സെപ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യോ ഇല്ലയോ എന്ന് എനിക്കറിയില്ല. പക്ഷെ മാർക്സിസം, സൈക്കോ അനാലിസിസ് ഒക്കെ ഓൾറെഡി ആക്സെപ്റ്റഡ് മോഡൽസ് ആണ്. അപ്പൊ അതിന്റെ ഇൻഫ്ലുവൻസ് ഏറ്റെടുക്കുക, അതിനനുസരിച്ച് നമ്മുടെ ക്രിറ്റിസിസത്തിനെ റീമോഡൽ ചെയ്യാന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ അത് കുറച്ചും കൂടി ലോകം നമ്മളെ ആക്സെപ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യുമെന്ന് നമ്മൾ വിചാരിക്കും. പക്ഷെ വി ഷുഡ് ഇമാൻസിപ്പേറ്റ് ourselves from that. We should free ourselves from the influence of accepted models, and we should guide ourselves by our own impulses. So feminist criticism should let itself be guided by its own impulses. And she says that gynocritics is already beginning to do so. This is not to deny the necessity of using the terminology and techniques of our profession. She says, just because I say that we shouldn't just borrow directly from Marxism or from psychoanalysis or from any existing theory, that is not to say that we should not use theory. We should not use theoretical terminology, conceptual terminology. We should not use the techniques of our profession. If we are academics, we should use academic terminology. We should use academic theory. If we are critics, we should use critical theory. So that is not to deny the necessity of using the terminology and techniques of our profession. We should do our job. We should have the tools to do our job. But what we should consider is the historical conditions in which critical ideologies are produced. So all the existing critical ideologies were produced in particular historical conditions, and they have their own necessities, they have their own reasons for being produced, but they have their own limitations precisely because of the historical conditions in which they were produced. And if we understand those historical conditions, then we realize that when we adapt those kind of theories for a feminist criticism, feminist adaptations of such theories would have reached an impasse. Impasse means a kind of point where you can't go any further. So feminist adaptations, feminist theorists have so far tried to adapt existing theories like Marxism, psychoanalysis, etc. But the problem with that is, first of all, that they were created for a particular purpose, for another purpose altogether, and if you just remodel them for your purpose, it will not fit your purpose properly. It will be like wearing men's ill-fitting hand-me-down clothes. And also the second point is that these critical ideologies were produced in certain historical conditions, because of which they have their own limitations and problems. And if we just adapt them, then we will be inheriting those problems as well, rather than moving forward in a free manner. So if we instead focus on women's experience, and from women's experience try to develop our own theory of feminist criticism, then we will be free from the influence of such accepted models. We will be free from the problems that can be inherited from such models as well. I think, shall we stop here now? Or do you think we have too long, 3 long paragraphs to go? More than three long paragraphs to go. Should we? Or we will quickly try to read one more paragraph. Unless some of you say stop, I'm going to read the next paragraph. Okay. So now she's talking about the problems faced by some of these new critical theories. The new sciences of the text, based on linguistics, computers, genetic structuralism, deconstructionism, neo-formalism and deformalism, affective stylistics, and psychoaesthetics, have offered literary critics the opportunity to demonstrate that the work they do is as manly and aggressive as nuclear physics, not intuitive, expressive, and feminine, but strenuous, rigorous, impersonal, and virile. So first of all, nowadays, the new sciences of the text, these are some examples that she gives: linguistics, computer, genetic structuralism, deconstructionism, neo-formalism, deformalism, psychoaesthetics, affective stylistics. ഇതൊക്കെ കേൾക്കുമ്പോൾ തന്നെ എന്തൊക്കെയോ സംഭവിക്കുന്നുണ്ട് എന്ന് നമുക്ക് തോന്നും. അപ്പോൾ ലിറ്റററി ക്രിറ്റിക്സ്, പണ്ടത്തെ മറ്റേ വേർഡ്സ്വർത്ത് എഴുതുന്നു, കോൾറിഡ്ജ് എഴുതുന്നു ക്രിറ്റിസിസം എന്നൊക്കെ പറയുമ്പോൾ, people think that just like literature, criticism, both literature and criticism are something very gentle, very expressive, almost feminine. But if you use these kind of terminologies, deconstruction, structuralism, psychoaesthetics, then they will sound very aggressive, very manly, very masculine. And this is a way in which male critics feel that they are much more masculine than they are considered to be traditionally. So the new male critics, the contemporary male critics, not just male critics, but the theories themselves try to sound very masculine. In a shrinking job market, these new levels of professionalism also function as discriminators between the marketable and the marginal lecturer. Another issue is that today there is a shrinking job market. More and more, it is getting more and more difficult to get a good academic job in a good university. So if you have all these kind of terminologies, then you will sound much more professional. So now there are certain quantitative ways of seeing how professional you are, and these kind of methods, these kind of theoretical terminologies help people to judge you as being more professional and make you a marketable lecturer rather than a marginal lecturer. So whether you get a good job or not depends on how well you can use these kind of theories. If you can't, then you become a marginal lecturer. You will not be part of any great university. Then literary science, in its manic generation of difficult terminology, its establishment of seminars and institutes of postgraduate study, creates an elite corps of specialists who spend more and more time mastering the theory, less and less time reading the books. So that is the next problem, that because of all these reasons, now there are a lot of specialists, theory specialists, who may not have read the books that they are talking about, but they have mastered the theory. So now there is an idea that if you know theory, you can talk about anything, whether or not you have actually read the books or not. So the books become much, much less important. What the author tried to convey or what was expressed in the books, none of those things are important, but rather it is just about showing off your mastery of theory. We are moving towards a two-tiered system of higher and lower criticism, the higher concerned with the scientific problems of form and structure, the lower concerned with the humanistic problems of content and interpretation. And these levels, it seems to me, are now taking on subtle gender identities and assuming a sexual polarity, hermeneutics and hismeneutics. So now she's saying that because of all these reasons, now criticism itself seems to have a two-tiered structure. Two tiers, രണ്ട് നിലയായിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു സ്ട്രക്ചർ ആണ് ഹയർ ക്രിറ്റിസിസം ആൻഡ് ലോവർ ക്രിറ്റിസിസം. ഹയർ എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ അതെന്തോ ഭയങ്കര സയന്റിഫിക് ആണെന്ന് തോന്നും. ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് കൺസേൺഡ് വിത്ത് ഫോം ആൻഡ് സ്ട്രക്ചർ ഓഫ് ദ ടെക്സ്റ്റ്, ആൻഡ് ദെൻ ഇറ്റ് വിൽ ഹാവ് ഓൾ ദീസ് ഗ്രേറ്റ് terminologies. The lower layer or the lower level, the lower tier of criticism deals with humanistic problems of content and interpretation. അപ്പോൾ ഒരു ടെക്സ്റ്റ് നമ്മൾ സ്റ്റഡി ചെയ്യുകയാണെങ്കിൽ അതിൽ എന്ത് പറയുന്നു, അതിൻ്റെ തീംസ് എന്താണ്, അതിൽ ഉപയോഗിച്ചിട്ടുള്ള എന്താണ് ലിറ്റററി ടെക്നീക്സ് എന്തൊക്കെയാണ്, ഇതൊക്കെയാണ് നമ്മുടെ പഴയ മോഡൽ ഓഫ് ക്രിറ്റിസിസം. ഇതെല്ലാം കോണ്ടന്റ് ആൻഡ് ഇന്റർപ്രിട്ടേഷൻ, ഇതൊക്കെ വെറും ഹ്യൂമനിസ്റ്റിക് പ്രോബ്ലംസ് ആണ്, അത് ലോ ലെവലാണ്. വേറാസ് ഫോം ആൻഡ് സ്ട്രക്ചർ, നമ്മൾ അതിന്റെ ലിംഗ്വിസ്റ്റിക് സ്ട്രക്ചർ നോക്കുന്നു, ടെക്സ്റ്റിന്റെ സ്ട്രക്ചർ നോക്കുന്നു, നമ്മൾ അതിനെ ഡീകൺസ്ട്രക്ട് ചെയ്യുന്നു, ഇതെല്ലാം എന്തോ വളരെ സയന്റിഫിക് ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഹയർ കൈൻഡ് ഓഫ് ക്രിറ്റിസിസം. അങ്ങനെ ഒരു ക്രിറ്റിസിസത്തിൽ തന്നെ ഒരു ഹയർ ആൻഡ് ലോവർ എന്നുള്ള ഒരു ഹയറാർക്കിക്കൽ സ്ട്രക്ചർ ഉണ്ടായവരാണ്. ആൻഡ് ഷീ സേസ് slowly these two layers or these two levels of criticism are taking on gender identities. There is a sexual polarity happening between them, hermeneutics and hismeneutics. This is again a pun that she is using. Hermeneutics actually means the science of interpretation of text, but she is punning on the word her, which refers to women, and she's saying that hermeneutics is now hermeneutics in the sense that it is something, the science of interpretation is something that women do, and then there is something that men do. As opposed to her, we have hismeneutics. Now hismeneutics is not a real term, അങ്ങനെ ഒരു സാധനമേ ഇല്ല ക്രിറ്റിസിസത്തിൽ. ഷീ ഈസ് ജസ്റ്റ് യൂസിങ് ഇറ്റ് ആസ് എ പൺ, ലൈക്ക് നമ്മൾ ഹിസ്റ്ററി ഹെർ സ്റ്റോറി എന്നൊക്കെ പറഞ്ഞാൽ നിങ്ങൾ കേട്ടിട്ടുണ്ടാവുമല്ലോ. അതുപോലെ ഹെർമെന്യൂട്ടിക്സ് ആൻഡ് ഹിസ്മെന്യൂട്ടിക്സ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ നമുക്കിതിനെ ഒരു സെക്ഷുവൽ ഒരു ഡിവിഷൻ വരികയാണ്. അതായത് ലോവർ ലെവൽ ഹ്യൂമനിസ്റ്റിക് പ്രോബ്ലംസ്, കോണ്ടന്റ്, ഇന്റർപ്രിട്ടേഷൻ, ഇതിനെല്ലാം these are the kind of jobs that are very feminine ennum. This is a kind of criticism that is very feminine ennum. The higher scientific problems of form and structure, that is much more glamorous and that is very masculine. This is the way in which even within criticism, gendered hierarchy is being created. Ironically, the existence of a new criticism practiced by women has made it even more possible for structuralism and Marxism to strive henchard-like for systems of formal obligation and determination. Feminists writing in these modes, such as Elaine Showalter and the women contributors to diacritics, risk being allotted the symbolic ghettos of the special issue or the back of the book for their essays. So, even though women are now they are trying to practice a new kind of criticism. New kind of criticism എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ they are actually basically depending on existing critical models. So ഈ പറയുന്ന ഹയർ സയന്റിഫിക് ആയ രീതിയിലൊക്കെ സ്ത്രീകളും ചെയ്യാൻ നോക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. വൺ ഇസ് മാസ്കുലിൻ, വൺ ഇസ് ഫെമിനിൻ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാലും men can do both, women can do both kind of criticism. So when women try to do that, basically women also are trying to say we are not feminine. We don't want to be relegated to the humanistic level of content and interpretation. We are also good enough to study these scientific problems of form and structure. Let us also do that. That is what people like she's now referring to certain French feminist critics like Elaine Showalter and other women writers and critics who contributed to this French journal called Diacritics. And you are familiar with Elaine Showalter from our discussion of the different stages of feminism, the the different generations of feminism, the second generation, second wave of feminists, the French feminists. Anyway, so she's saying that such feminists, there are a lot of feminists who also try to write in these modes, in looking at form, structure, etc. They are structural feminists, Marxist feminists, post-structural feminists, etc. But the problem is that this is actually the domain of men. So even when women write in these structures, according to these theoretical frameworks, they are just they are also marginalized. The great writers in Marxism, the great writers in structuralism, etc., will always be men, and the few women who are writing in these modes will be ghettoized. They will be marginalized. They will be, maybe if there is a a set of issues of a journal on structuralism, then maybe there will be one single issue, a special issue for the writings by women. So it will sound as if they are doing something great by having a special issue only for women writers. But then the women are delegated, they are ghettoized, they are marginalized into that small space. Or if there is a book of writings on, say, psychoanalytic theory, then the back of the book, the last one or two essays might be by women. So those were the ways in which women tried to become part of this higher scientific form of criticism, but they were accommodated, but they were still marginalized within the spaces of those kind of criticisms. Okay. So I think we can stop now. It's almost an hour and we have a little bit more left, something like 2.5 pages. Yeah, somebody wants to say something? I think. Yes. Radhu? Shall we do that then? Shall we stop now and continue tomorrow?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So we'll stop. I'll stop recording.